Welcome to the chapter Cell, its structure and function. We all know about the cell. Cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. We learned that every living organism is made up of cells. Just like how a wall is made out of bricks, a living organism is made up of cells. So cell is the basic unit of life. In your lower classes, you already learned that cells are made up of some parts. That means every cell is made up of some components. Each cell has got some other parts inside it. And you studied some of the parts. You studied about the nucleus, cytoplasm and other parts of the cell. You also learned about the shapes of cells. You learned that cells exist in different shapes. Some cells in oval shape, some in round shape, some are cubical, some are cylindrical. This way, the cells exist in different shapes. So, you learned about the shapes of the cell and you learned about parts of the cell and you also learned about the sizes of the cell. That is different size. We know that cells are very small, microscopic. That means we can see the cells only under microscope. But there are some cells which can be seen with the naked eye. So you learnt about the different sizes. We know that the smallest cell, it measures in microns, micrometers. Whereas the biggest cell, ostrich egg, is the known biggest cell that we can see with our naked eye. So cells exist in different sizes. We also learnt about the classification, division of organisms based upon the number of cells they contain. Certain organisms, this is the classification or division. So all the organisms are divided into two groups according to the number of cells, that is unicellular, multicellular. So what is this unicellular, multicellular? We learned that the organisms that have only one cell throughout their life are called unicellular organisms. Examples: amoeba, paramecium, euglena. These are the examples of unicellular organisms. At the same time, we also learnt about multicellular organisms. Organisms that have number of cells. Some organisms may have 10 cells, some have hundreds, some thousands, millions, trillion. So, depends upon the size and complexity of the organism, it may have millions of cells. So, all these organisms, right from 10, 100,000 or million, all these organisms are called multicellular organisms. So, this is the division of organisms depending upon the number of cells they have. So these are the different kind of topics which we have learnt in our lower classes. Now, what we are going to learn now? Now, we are going to learn about the parts of a cell. What are the inner parts of a cell? What we call them as cell organelles. So we learned that a cell consists of different parts which have different functions. We call these parts as cell organelles. In this lesson, we are going to study about the functions and the structure of cell organelles, the different parts that are found inside a cell. Okay, now we see studying cells. So how do we study cells? To observe the cells, we need some special instruments. So you might have learned how Robert Hooke and Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed the tiny things, microorganisms. So they used an instrument called microscope. So we need a microscope to study or to observe the cells. So microscopes are of different types. So we have three different types of microscopes. Basically, simple microscope, and compound microscope and electron microscope. So the simple microscope is a very simple instrument which is used to observe the stomata or some of the outline features of a cell. If you wanted to observe some kind of bigger plant cells or animal cells, we can use the simple microscope to observe. But it is not possible to observe the inner parts, the cell organelles like nucleus or cell wall or so on. Such kind of things we cannot see in a simple microscope. We can use a compound microscope to study the cells. So compound microscope is used to observe the cell and its organelles like nucleus, and we can see the cell wall or cell membrane. So these kind of things can be observed in a compound microscope. So by using a compound microscope, we can observe the nucleus, cell membrane, etc. But if you wanted to study all the other parts like mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, so on, it is not possible by using a compound microscope. So then the scientists need more powerful microscope, which is called as electron microscope. So this is a very powerful microscope which is used by scientists or research scholars, professors to study the cells in detail. The cell organelles like mitochondria, chloroplast, and the nucleus and nucleolus and all the other things can be studied by this electron microscope. So to study, to observe the cells, we need the special instruments like microscopes. Now, typical cell. What is a typical cell? We know plant cells and we know animal cells. Now, what is this typical cell? So, typical cell is nothing but a model cell which represent all the cell organelles present in the cell. Say for example, if you take an animal cell, animal cells have different parts like nucleus and mitochondria and Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum, vacuoles, nucleolus, so on. So every animal cell do not have all the cell organelles. Some animal cells have more number of mitochondria and they may or may not have a Golgi body. They may or may not have a vesicle. So we are drawing a general diagram. So this is a general diagram which represent an animal cell that showing all the cell organelles which generally appear in an animal cell is called a typical cell. So a typical cell may not exist as it is. We are drawing a generalized diagram of animal cells. That means different cells of animals have different kind of cell organelles. For example, the cells of a gland, salivary gland, we have a salivary gland which involves in the function of secreting saliva. So saliva is secreted by these glands. They have the cells which contain more number of Golgi bodies compared to other cell organelles because they are involved in the process of secretion. So these Golgi bodies helps in the process of secretion. So they have more in number. So a typical cell is a generalized cell diagram which represent all the different cell organelles that exist in a animal cell or a plant cell. If you take a plant cell example, see, when we are drawing a plant cell, basically we draw a big vacuole at the center and we draw some kind of plastids and we draw a thick cell wall. This is a generalized diagram of a plant cell. So we call it as a typical cell, a typical plant cell. So that means we are showing whatever the different kind of cell organelles found in plant cells, all types of cell organelles we are drawing in a single diagram. So this is called as a typical cell diagram of a plant. For example, if you see some cells of a plant, they do not possess chloroplast because the chloroplasts are found in the green parts of a plant. Say like tender stems or in the leaves, we find the chloroplast. We do not find the chloroplast in all the cells of a plant, but in general, when we are drawing the diagram of a typical cell, generally we draw a chloroplast and other parts like vacuole, everything. All parts we draw and we write it as a plant cell. Which plant cell this is? This is a typical plant cell which is representing all the organelles of the plant cell. Now, here we have the diagrams of a typical plant cell and an animal cell. Now, let us label their parts and see the differences and similarities among them. So, this is a plant cell and this is an animal cell. So, plant cell has got a thick cell wall, and inside the cell wall there is a thin membrane, plasma membrane or cell membrane, and inside it has got cytoplasm. And at the center, most of the space of the cell is occupied by a vacuole. This is a vacuole, and here we have a dark body, that is the nucleus. And inside the nucleus there is nucleolus, and it has got a Golgi bodies or Golgi apparatus and mitochondria, and it has plastids. So these are the basic parts, and here is the animal cell. The animal cell is bound or surrounded by plasma membrane. So this plasma membrane is common for both plant and animal cell. And next, if you see the mitochondria is found in both plant as well as in animal cells. Here it has got a nucleus, this is also common, and this is the nucleus and this is nucleolus, and it has got endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum is found here, and cytoplasm is also common. So here in case of a plant cell, we find an extra covering, that is the thick cell wall. Now we are going to study about the organelles of a cell. First we are going to learn about cell membrane. Cell membrane. So cell membrane is the outer covering of a cell. It is found in both plant cells as well as in animal cells. But whereas the plant cells, they have an additional covering, that is the cell wall, and whereas animal cells, they have only one, that is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a very thin and a flexible layer. So this thin flexible membrane, this is made up of lipids, that is the fats, and proteins. So these are the materials by which this cell membrane is made. Now, what is the function of this cell membrane? The cell membrane, it gives a shape to the cell. Cell is having a specific shape like oval or like spherical or cylindrical. It has got its own shape. The shape is maintained because of the cell membrane. That means it is giving support and shape to the cells. It is packing the inner contents of the cell. Inside the cell, cytoplasm and other cell organelles are floating. So the total entity is packed up by this cell membrane. So the cell membrane is very thin, which cannot be seen through an ordinary microscope. Even using a compound microscope, we cannot find this cell membrane. We cannot study it in detail. Only through an electron microscope, this cell membrane is clearly visible. So this cell membrane, it maintains the balance inside the cell. What is the balance? The balance of the composition. So inside the cell there is some specific composition of nutrients and water and other materials. So the environment inside the cell is different from outside the cell. The extracellular environment is different from intracellular environment. So this difference is properly maintained by the cell membrane. What does it mean? It means that the cell membrane do not allow any substances into this cell. It means it allows only selective substances. It permits only selected substances into the cell. So by that it is not disturbing the balance. So this nature of the cell membrane is called as selectively permeable. What does it mean? It is not allowing all the components to get inside. It is not allowing the whole water or ions into the cell. It is allowing them selectively. Only the selected or permitted materials are allowed to enter into the cell by this cell membrane. So this nature is called as selective permeability. Only because of the selective permeability, the cell is able to maintain the balance of ions or the balance of nutrients or the amount of water or whatever. So the internal environment is in equilibrium because the nature of the cell membrane. If it is not so, what happens to the cell? If the cell membrane is not selectively permeable, the extra water inside the cell may come out and the cell get dehydrated, or more water may enter inside the cell may blast. So all these things are not happening. That is because of the selective permeable nature of the cell membrane. The cell membrane, it is also called as plasma membrane. So why it is called as plasma membrane? Because it is surrounding the plasma. So whatever the inner fluid content that we call a plasma, it is surrounded by the membrane. So the cell membrane is also called as a plasma membrane. Now we are going to talk about the cell wall. We know that cell wall is the extra outer covering of a cell. So if this is a plant cell, this is the cell membrane and this one is the cell wall. So how is the cell wall? The cell wall is thick and it is rigid compared to the cell membrane. The cell membrane is very thin and very flexible. Even though the cell wall is a bit flexible, it is hard. It gives strength to the plant cells. See, if you touch wood, it is hard to touch. If you touch your hand, your flesh, your muscles, they are soft enough. So when compared to animal cells and plant cells, there is a difference. You find them hard. The tissues of plants are a bit hard because of the cell walls, the hard cell walls they have. So the cell wall in a plant cell, what is its function? It gives support to the cell and it encounters the inner pressure. Inside the cell, there is a lot of pressure on the cell membrane. So this pressure is encountered. The reverse pressure is applied by the cell wall. So that is the major function of the cell wall. Cell wall is made up of, we learned that cell membrane is made up of lipids and proteins. Then what is this cell wall is made up of? Cell wall is made up of a material called cellulose. You might have heard this name cellulose. Cellulose is a kind of carbohydrate. So cellulose is used to make paper. So you know that we get paper from trees. That is the pulp of bamboo and other trees. So the pulp, it consists of this material cellulose. That means they are crushing the wood, the pulp, and they are extracting the cell walls. That is the cellulose, which is made into paper. So cellulose is the fiber part. Okay, so this is the importance of cell wall in a plant cell. Now what are the other uses of cell wall? Only giving the support or any other functions? Earlier, it was thought that the cell wall is not having any specific functions, just to support the cell and cell membrane. But now, it is found that the cell wall plays an important role in transformation of substances or information. So that is the other major function of the cell wall. Now, we are going to discuss about the nucleus. So nucleus is the dark body found in a cell. So nucleus is found in both plant as well as in animal cells. So what is the main function of this nucleus? Nucleus is the controller of the cell. So all the cell activities are controlled by the nucleus. So it is the head of the cell. So just like how your school is controlled by your principal, a cell and other parts of the cell are controlled by the nucleus.